Welcome back to the Rugby League Digest. I'm Michael Adams here with Andrew Paskin. How's it going, Andy?
I'm well, mate. How are you?
Good. It's been a while. We're both really pumped for this one. You especially, because this is a case study on your beloved Canberra Raiders. And who better to talk about the Raiders with than former Canberra Times journalist and then Raiders media manager Bevan Hannan. We're thrilled to have you, Bevan. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great to be with you, fellas. Really looking forward to it.
Welcome.
I was very familiar with your work, Bevan, having embarked on this research project. It seems like just about every article written about the Raiders in the early mid-90s was written by you. I just want to get a bit of background on how you got there and your history with the Raiders. So do you want to talk a bit about the Raiders, your history with Canberra and the team?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I'm actually a born and bred Canberran. And the Raiders were a real family focal point for me growing up in the 80s. I've got really wonderful memories of with my dad and my mates watching the Green Machine as a kid out at Seaford Oval in Queanbeyan, where they started out, and the trips that we made, the pilgrimages to Sydney to take on the big Sydney teams. It was always a thrill. I'd actually started following league before the Raiders started in '82. And I do remember taking a sickie in '78 on a Tuesday when there was a grand final replay, and I can still remember Steve Rogers trudging back to the restarts when they were getting done by Manly. But I was in fact an Eastman, and one of the reasons was which that became really ingrained because Noel Cleal joined the Roosters in 1980, and he came from a town called Scone, where one side of my family's from, in the Hunter region of New South Wales, and I'd seen the Crusher play in the flesh up there for the Thoroughbreds, and I'd already had a liking for East, and that ingrained my following. There was also a Scone connection with the Raiders first team, a guy called Mick Tilse. He played front row in that first game, and you guys might remember his son Dane played a couple of hundred first grade games for the Raiders a bit later on.
Yeah,
we went to most Raiders games out at Seaford, and it was such a great place to watch the footy. You were so close to the action, and when there was a big game on, there was a big crowd. The joint was just heaving, and they must have felt like supermen. That's what I thought at the time. In my first year at high school, Neil Henry, who went on obviously to coach the club and do other great things in rugby league, he was earning his teaching stripes, and I recognise Slippers as being one of the lower graders, and so he got a poster signed for me from all the players, which took pride of place in my room for years, and they were just great days out there having those big Sydney teams come down here and play. I remember one of my birthdays, Manly were here on a wet Saturday arvo, and there was Krilich and Boyd and Bowstead, and even I think John Rebo might have been on the Sting that day, and it was just it was great. It was just great to have those teams playing here, and a local team that was actually sticking it to them. And the players like Jay Hoffman, Ashley Gilbert, some of those originals, and Steve O'Callaghan, John Hardy. They were, they played with such heart, and it was, just great to see the way they grew as a team. But back in those days, it wasn't just the team you followed; it was the club. There were three grades, and when you went out to watch them play, you go and see all three grades. And at Seaford, when the players walked out onto the ground or ran out onto the ground, the players' race had to close the gates on either side. There was a wide gates which created that players' race tunnel, which went across the main walkway in front of the grandstand. And there was always a surge to get your hands on the wires of that race, and you'd be urging on your team and sticking it to the visitors. And it was just a real buzz to watch footy, and a great place. And probably the 1984 season sticks out of my memory the most. That team was really, really special to me. They went to within a game of making the finals. They made a playoff, and to do that within 3 years of starting out in the comp was quite an achievement.
And it seems in those early years, there's a real sense of kind of hometown heroes, and Canberra or the region as like this kind of local team, which is quite different to the dream team, the huge success of the 90s. Are there any differences that you remember from watching the team in those early days?
Look, there was a Raiders way, like they could always score tries. I remember, that team of 1984, which is really special to me. I bet, Andy, you got your favourite calls from the 90s from Rabs, have you? But you could roll them off to me, your favourite tries.
Well, the Brett Mullins ones are always my favourites, but
yeah. I thought you'd say that. And for me, my favourites, and maybe it's because you're looking through the eyes of a kid. There was in 1984, my old team, the Roosters, came to play the Raiders, and I think it was our very first Sunday big game telecast, the Channel 10 big game, and they've been on the telly for the midweek games and the KB Cup and for maybe the Saturday afternoon ABC game, but they hadn't had the top billing before. And the Roosters came down, and my all-time favourite, Rabs called one of those tries. It was from deep inside the Raiders half, and Paul Elliott, who was a ball-playing back rower, he was involved, but it went through the back line. Sullivan, Henjak, Craig Bellamy was there, and then it was finished off by Terry Fay, flying Terry Fay. And going back home that night to see it on the telly when they'd scored 40 points and hearing the Rabbit's call, it just added a little bit of extra magic dust on the whole thing. But probably one of the most significant parts of that period was the wins that they had in successive years in 83 and 84 over Parramatta. Parramatta were the team. They won 3 premierships in a row, and they came down to Seaford twice and got mugged by the Raiders side. And David Grant was massive in both of those wins. Another great Rabs call. David Grant scored the decisive try in that 1984 game, and Rabs said that he took off like Moss Trooper. Yeah, legendary old jump source, and he did. He dived. He launched himself out of that Eels defence to score. And Ronnie Giddo was the captain that day, and he'd had a lot of experience sort of playing with East and West in the Sydney comp. And he always said to me that David Grant never got the credit he deserved for what he did in those formative days. Gitz described him as the head of the snake, who the other teams had to shut down first. And they were great memories what he did and what those boys did then. I may be able to confirm it, but I reckon I've still got a souvenir from that second Parramatta win where, in those days you run out in the field after the game, and I think I might have grabbed one of the old flags behind the dead ball area on a wooden stake just as a little souvenir of that occasion. It was a really exciting day.
That's awesome, man. I've got to say, it reminds me of when the Knights come into the comp up here and you're sort of supporting this club that you're not really looking for the grand final. All you want is the visiting teams to know they've had a game, and there's something special about the formative years of a club.
Yeah, there's no question. Look, one of the other things that sticks out in the early 80s for me is actually when we went to visit, some of the Sydney clubs. And I remember going to Redfern Oval in the early 80s, and I can still see Mario Fennick revving up the Rabbitohs. They were warming up in a little park outside of Redfern Oval, and went inside the ground. But my other vivid memory that day was my dad talking out the corner of his mouth and saying, get that beanie off. And because one of the locals had decided to use that as a bit of an ashtray during the first half. And so I had to get it off quick smart.
I wanted to ask you about, this is another piece of connective tissue between East and the Raiders, a man who coached both of them, Don Ferner. Could you put into words what he did for the club and the role he played in getting them to where they got to in the 90s?
Yeah, look, Donnie Ferner was great. I think Gus Gould gets a bit of stick about the old Penrith 5-year plan, but that's what Donnie Ferner Senior had when the Raiders first came in. He always said that they'd need 5 years to be competitive, and he delivered in spades when you consider that 84 team that went within a breath of making the finals, and then in 87 they made the grand final. They couldn't have laid better foundations with what he had to work with, because he was a great leader for the club. He was so well respected. He came across as a father figure, really, because he was just patiently, raising up his sire and instilling confidence in them. And his experience was really important. You're right. He coached that. He got Arthur Beats into the Roosters. He got them to a grand final in the early 70s. And I think John Quayle might have been a part of that Rooster side back in that era. But either side of that, Donnie Ferner, he had a phenomenal record coaching the Queanbeyan Blues, down here in the Group 8 comp. He, won 10 premierships or something in 13 years. And, when the Raiders started, I think they had 4 wins in the premiership in the first year. They had a KB Cup win as well from memory, but 4 wins in the premiership. And then in 83, they went to 9. And then, on the verge of the finals in 84. And what was remarkable about that was the constraints that they were working in, because it was the 13 import rule, which had been in place since the mid-70s. And what it meant the league's conditions were you had to have 3 teams, you had to have 3 grades, so you're talking 55 players. And so it's a big call. You can only bring in 13. You're relying on 42 from your local league. And even Jack Gibson, he said, back then at that time that, the league needed to do something about the 13 import rule just to help make those new sides, Canberra and Illawarra, more competitive, And that's always been a bit of a point of contention down here and with the Raiders about how that went down in comparison to, what happened when Cronulla and Penrith started, for example. They didn't have that same handicap. So, but Donny was really, really important in those early years. He laid a great foundation.
And some parallels there with bringing Arthur Beetson in to the Roosters, inspiring them to great success. Doing the same with Mal Meninga in 85, I think was his first year, wasn't it? 85 or 86. But what are your early memories of Mal coming to the Raiders?
Yeah, look, you're right about Big Mal. Look, that was 86 that he came, and that was a real catalyst. It was a huge turning point for the club. It drew other quality players at the same time. Gary Belcher came down at the same time. Gary Coyne, Steve Walters he was sort of coming through then, but just some really good players sort of came with him, and then Peter Jackson sort of followed a year later. Look, it was really important because after 84, 85, they had a bit of a dip. They had a good start and then faded. They don't like to call them the faders, but they did that year. And the only really bright spot, I think, in 85 was they got to the grand final of reserve grade, and St George tipped them out in the last seconds of that game. But 86, Mal had arrived and it didn't quite live up to the promise. And they didn't make a lot of progress that year. And this is where sort of Mal's presence came in a bit more beyond just being a player draw card, I guess. Donny Ferner, he was made the Australian coach that year. But there were louder whispers around town that McMahon, who'd coached that reserve grade side, was pushing for a takeover. And there'd been a bit of conjecture about the players complaining the training was getting a bit stale, and they needed to do something else. And the Raiders were known in those early days. They were known for the Mad Hour. That a trainer called Brian Burke. He was an old Queanbeyan Blues legend. There's a statue of him actually in the Queanbeyan Leagues Club foyer from his playing days, and he was infamous for his tough training sessions. But with Meninga and Belcher coming down, they had links to Brisbane, and they'd sort of had exposure to Wayne Bennett. And so while there was this conjecture around the place about what they need to do, it actually opened the way for them to sort of push Bennett's cause a bit. And club boss John McIntyre, I think that's when he hatched the plan to bring Bennett down as a co-coach, and for a changing of the guard, but to work together as a combo. And it worked a treat. History shows at 87, Canberra became the first non-Sydney team to make the grand final, and that duo won the coach of the year. Now the succession plan was sort of scuppered a bit, I guess, because the Broncos ended up pinching Bennett back. But I have to say this, and I've got really vivid memories of this, that the impact that Bennett had in that short time. I know Timmy Sheens came in and he did a wonderful job in that golden era coaching the club. But the impact that Bennett had in that short time, it was very, very clear, and it flowed right throughout the district, right throughout the grades. Meninga and Belcher, knew about the emphasis he placed on skills coaching and coaching under pressure skills. And Donny Ferner had said that a new voice, to help bring that discipline to the defence they needed to uptick in that area was important. But it was much more than that, the influence. His modern coaching ideals, he really took the coaching director role very seriously. And so he set up this coaching panel, which he overlooked to really have a big focus on coaching. And there was the guy who'd been doing a lot of the development work for Canberra in the 80s, in their formative years, was a fellow by the name of Steve Hewson. And they called him Shovels from an injury he had when he was playing. But he was, one of the great prospects to come out of Queanbeyan and the area, who injury basically curtailed his career. He played for country in 75 in the team that beat City. He played for New South Wales that year, And I think he was offered by Manly. Wanted to lure him into the big smoke. But he came back and he pretty much straight away did 2 bad knee injuries in a row, and it was the end of his career. So he ended up staying in the area and got involved with the Raiders in development. And he did an exceptional job. But I still remember him talking about, the rapid growth that occurred following the Bennett effect, basically. The panel that he oversaw, it was about, instilling the Raiders way, through the whole coaching system, through the juniors. He set up a youth squad, and Bradley Clyde was part of that first one, I'm pretty sure. And that meant that, our best juniors were exposed to elite coaching in the facilities at the AIS, which we had. And, that emphasis, breathed this fresh outlook, and it had a real impact. And I also remember Craig Bellamy was one of the handful of people who did their level 2 coaching certificates that year. Not many get through on their level 2, and that was a sign of things to come for him. But the junior coaches across the region ate it up, and it really did help build, a strong built on the strong foundation was there. Took it to another level and really did set it up for the era that was to come. And as I said, it was noticed right throughout the region. That effect in that short time that Bennett had.
It's a major trope in this podcast, the sliding doors moments in rugby league, but like the Alan McMahon, Wayne Bennett trade-off. So the Knights got McMahon, and it was solid. But if that happened in Canberra, who knows where we would be now? Yeah,
no, there's a few of those. There's a few of those. I know you like your sliding doors, but yeah, it's But if Mal hadn't have come down, would that have happened? Would the Bennett thing have happened? I don't know, but it did, and it was certainly an important part of the Raiders' history.
And then coming on off the back of that, so you've laid your foundation, you've added to the foundation with what Bennett did. Then you have this all-time crop of young blokes coming through. You mentioned Clyde. Stewart comes over from rugby union. Laurie Daly comes through. This is also the time when you're getting started as a journalist. So can you maybe talk about some of your early experiences following the team in a professional capacity?
Yeah, well, it started following it as a hobby, to tell you the truth, and it turned into a job. So I suppose the Potter backstory is, I was pretty lucky to have a few really good rugby league men who just took an interest in what I was doing and gave me some opportunities, and it basically led to work, I guess. And it started by being a bit of a prize pig on a Saturday morning radio show. The then ACT Rugby League, they ran the local comp, and their PR man, Lee Donnelly, had this radio show, and I think he got sick of me ringing in and winning the competitions, the quiz. And I was 13 at the time, and he said, come in, and he basically got me to start doing reports on Junior League then. And that led to writing for the Raider magazine, which was the organ for the club. Then I also got to be doing stuff for the Canberra Times, while I was going through high school, basically doing junior and local league reporting. And so, so even in those days, I guess, when I'm sort of doing it as a hobby, but, it's still getting, quite a bit of exposure. The whole club, very accessible, every level, whether it was administrators to the players. And the thing that always struck me was there was always a level head in the joint, they worked really hard to keep each other grounded. They had some really good leaders who had pride in their club. Dean Lance was a standout for me. He played 5'8" in that first win Canberra had, but he was playing 5'8" for Newtown. And then he joined Canberra 2 years later, and he made the transition to the back row from the backs, and he just set high standards in everything that he did, and gave his all and played above his weight. And he was everything what the Raiders were about. Really well respected, really good to deal with, and he captained Canberra so well on and off the field in that charge to that 87 grand final. But then, then all the love of the road, Terry Regan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's the one that Matty Johns credits as being the inspiration for Reg Reagan.
That's right.
Yeah. And, he was again, another one who played, above his weight here, wherever he went really, but he was up for anything. There was one year that a local A-grader wanted to have a fight with him, and they jumped in the ring for a $500 purse. And, they were working back then. Just remember they were working back then, and, they've got normal jobs and they're training at night, and you're having to, track them down to do stories. And even someone like Terry Regan, he was doing a trash buck business at the time, I remember, and he, he'd ring you back at the arranged time, and you'd have it when he finished his trash back run, he'd have a yarn, and he always made me laugh. But there was always a bit of a serious side to him as well. It wasn't all joking around or the mug lair. He was, there was one story I remember I did with him. It was all about headgear, wearing headgear, and he didn't want the kids to think there was a stigma with wearing that. So that was pretty cool. But look, I did a lot of interviews with the kids coming through and coaches coming through. So the likes of Laurie Daly, I did interviews with him when he first came from Junee, when he was playing Jersey Flag before he went into grade. So I was able to build a lot of relationships and contacts in that time. And, whether it was a rookie Raider or the coaches, both Donnie Ferner and Wayne Bennett, or Mal even, all personable, all accommodating. And, it was a really, really, very fortunate and very generous with their time.
Well, I have to ask you about one man that may or may not be accommodating. Bevan is one R. Stewart. How is he to deal with?
Yeah, look, I formed a pretty good relationship with Ricky, I've got to say. I actually used to ghost his column, so that always helps.
Oh, really? That's unreal.
And there's a book that I actually heard you boys talking about that you didn't mind. I know you're not a big fan of the biographies, but the Alfie Langer one.
Yeah.
Ricky did the forward for that, and that may have involved me drafting that for him. But yeah, so I had a fair bit to do with him. He was always straight. He was always really straight. I mean, he could get cranky at times, but he was always straight and honest to deal with. And I got on very well with him, and I found him pretty good to deal with. I think the day that everyone thought he was his crankiest was when he was in the crosshairs of the ARL Super League offering around that April Fool's Day time of '95. That was he was under immense pressure. I think that's where everyone said they saw him at his crankiest. He was really, really, really good to deal with. And look, he was also it was almost like he was born to not just lead the club, but he was born to coach. His old man was a pretty handy local player who'd won some at least one competition down here, and his old man actually coached the Raiders' first semi-final team, and that was 83, I think that was the SG Ball team. Ricky was in it, and they got to the finals. But Ricky and the other gun they had in the forwards were both at St Edmunds College, a rugby school, and they had a clash with an important rugby game on the same day, and rugby won out, and so they had to stand down from the Raiders semi-final. They got touched up in that by the Eels, but his dad definitely has some coaching genes in him, and certainly passed on to Ricky.
Well, I remember reading his book or one of the books, and he was speaking about his father, and you can see that his father was a real down to earth guy, and he sort of, I don't know, he had immense respect for him, obviously, but he hasn't sort of adopted those traits himself some of the times. I think he'd like to be more like his father sometimes.
Yeah, look, I have to say though, he's what he's done, since coming back, to coach, and where the Raiders have come in that time and what they've done to rebuild a sort of and get back a bit to what they had in the past in those golden days has been it's been pretty important, and it's a very different feel around town now to what it was for a period when they were sort of in the wilderness a bit.
Well, I mean, I'm sure Michael was going to get to it anyway, but I mean, there's probably no one else that could have done it the way he's done it in the last few years. I mean, it was a proper build, a proper spirit, camaraderie, the whole thing, and it just fits. Yeah.
Look at my sliding doors moment. To throw into that mix, and was what would have happened if. And so after Mal had his crack at the coaching, they had a handover, a transition there as well, where they went with Matt Elliott, and that was down to two, and the second person in the running there was Craig Bellamy, who'd sort of again, he was one of the really wholehearted hard trainers, was just so so valuable to that group of men who were part of those original Raiders, and had come through and had done an apprenticeship coaching, had gone to be Wayne Bennett's right hand man, and he was in the running there in the early 2000s to take over for Mel. And my memory was it was between Elliott and Bellamy. And what if they had have gone with Bellamy? Would have we? Yeah.
I want to stay in the glory years for a little bit because it's something Andrew and I talk about on air and off air constantly. Is that Raiders team? We're both we were raised by that team basically. So I want to start with Grand Final Day 1989. Can you talk me through your day?
Yeah, Grand Final Day 89. Yeah, so I was actually at the game. I wasn't working that day. So 89. So I was a year before starting permanently at the Canberra Times, and so I'd been doing radio and other stringing work, and I'd actually been working at a place called West Belconnen Leagues Club. Neil Henry's father, Ian, as I was sort of getting to the end of year 12, had offered me a start doing a traineeship there in sort of sports admin, and I was doing that and combining the media stuff. And so when it came to Grand Final Day, I wasn't actually working, so I was actually seated there with my dad and some friends, and we were sort of in that corner. Or towards that corner where Chicka Ferguson scored that late try to which helped set up extra time. And we actually had in our group, there was a bright yellow cardboard sign with the word "All Right" on it, and it comes up in the footage when you replay after the tries. Well, that's exactly where we were, and that was just a magical time for Canberra. The run up to the grand final, the pride that swelled. We'd had a practice run in '87, but this was, we knew we were a real crack at being the first non-Sydney team to win it. And one of my good mates and I, we had a bit of extra cheer because we'd actually backed the Raiders to win the grand final earlier in the year at 16-1.
Wow.
And, yeah, and so we'd had, I don't know where we got the money from, but we had $100 each on it. And so it was more money than a couple of 18-year-olds had ever seen back then. And so that gave us a bit of extra volume in the voice. And Angel Marina, he was one of the Raiders originals. He actually, one of his big games that he played back in '82, he got a hat trick when they beat St. George down here. He was sitting in the same bay. I remember the victory lap because Bradley Clyde, he'd actually grown up in the same area as us, and we knew him quite well, and he'd stopped on the victory lap. And my mate sort of had a plastic cup of beer, and Clyde took a bit of a swig out of it in pure relation. And it was just a magic day. The interesting little quirky story to it, I guess, is Victor the Viking. And no one's usually interested when I tell this, but I think you blokes won't mind it.
We certainly are.
So Tony Wood was the original Victor the Viking, and he still is. Like, he's still doing it now. Like, he started doing it, whether it was '83 was the first year, but it was very early in the piece, and he's still doing it now. He's a life member. He's a brilliant bloke, and he's just been he's given great service to the club. He turns up to promotions and does all sorts of stuff. If there's an event on, Victor turns up, and you see Tony's there underneath the costume. But the thing is, he's a big Queanbeyan man, and he wasn't happy about them moving to Bruce Stadium in 1990. And so when that was all on in '89, he stopped being Victor. And so his place was taken by, what would you call, a colourful racing identity, you'd probably call him, who would later go on. And so I digress for a moment. This guy, he later went on. He was the mascot for the New South Wales Origin team that had a cockroach, Bluey or something they called it. And he made headlines. He made headlines into the '90s because he was up on some sort of fraud charges, and he was throwing up all these excuses, not to attend court, like his mum had died and she hadn't, and he showed up in colostomy bags and all sorts of things to try and not have to face the music. But anyway, that's a side story. But the thing was that in '89, I do remember there was a complaint from one of the players, and I forget who it was, but it was on match day, and they were trying to get a massage, before the start of the game, or get a bit of tightness out of one of the muscles, and they were trying to get on the rub-down table, and there's bloody Victor getting a rub-down, loosening up his routine, and they said to me, "What's going on here? That's not a day's bar, And so it goes without saying that after the grand finals, it was a bit of a travesty that Tony didn't get to do that. But John McIntyre did talk him to come back into the role in 1990, and he was there for when they moved to Bruce Stadium, and he's been doing it ever since. But yeah, that's probably the one missing bit of that 89 grand final that I would have liked to have seen to make it perfect.
I've got to say though, mate, it's very rugby league to have the mascot boycotting over a personal feud. It's very, very rugby league.
Well, and I'm pretty sure that the reason he became a mascot was he was actually mates with Martin Maguire, and he thought, I can do this, and so he started doing it down here. So, yeah. Moving
on to that rest of the run in the 90s, you timed your run perfectly to be starting at the Canberra Times at a time when the Raiders were, everything in terms of rugby league. Can you put into words what was special about that team or why they were as good as they were?
Yeah, look, it was the way they went about their footy, and while winning's important, like when you're following a team, I suppose it's about the connection as well, and the community really felt that they were part of it, and they were sort of living and working, and many of them had day jobs, whether it was Chica Ferguson at Warmold or wherever they were, they all had a place in the community, and they loved the way they played the game. They loved the way they represented the club, and then just what they did to go on that run in '89 to make the grand final, let alone win it. It was just such a special time, but it was the culmination of all things, because you had a combination of the players who'd been there from day one, who'd done the hard yards and were there, that had some acquisitions, who'd added to that, over the years to put some steel into them, and then the Queenslanders, and then there was a whole bunch of juniors which came through at the same time, and it was just an incredible team, and it was they were certainly the biggest show in town, and pretty much the biggest show in rugby league in the end. Though, if people didn't like them, they were certainly their second team.
Well, it's almost Melbourne Storm-esque, that the fact that they reinvented themselves from the 87 era to the 89, 90, 91 era, and then to the 93, 94 era. Like, there's three different distinct teams there. It's and they all had their pluses, but that 89 to 91 era, like guys like Mark Bell and Paul Martin and these unsung sort of guys, I really love that aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, I remember for the 87 grand final, one of the things I did in grand final week was I rang Ron Casey. Ron Casey had his talkback show on Sydney Radio at the time, and I had a period off at school, and I rang him because he was one of the big critics of the Raiders when they started off, and was always on their back, and I just want to give him a bit of a call to say, what do you got to say now? And I still got a bit of ear bashing and calling me Wally, but I still enjoyed it, and there was this wave of enthusiasm and this unprecedented excitement. The traffic that went up and down the highway to go to all the semi-final games. Those cafes and some of those stopover points before all the bypasses happened, would have made a squillion out of petrol stops and cafe stops from all the Raiders fans. In '87, I was doing a little bit of refereeing then, and one of the semi-finals when they played South. I was doing one of the junior games at the cricket ground, sort of either, I think it was before the game or half time. And I do remember actually poor Steve Maven passing me as he was leaving after being tormented by the Raiders kicking game that day, and when they blitzed South out of the comp. But one of the things the Raiders did in that '87 that they never did again was they actually had a street parade before they got to the big one. They had all the players in open top classic cars, and they did this big parade through the streets of Queanbeyan and Canberra, and because everyone wanted a piece of them, and they decided to meet that excitement. But they never actually did a pre grand final event again. But I was in year 11 at the time then, and you talk about those unsung heroes. Like the start of the year in '87, their two frontline wingers were John Ferguson and Terry Fay. And they didn't make it to grand final day in '87 because of injury, and Terry Fay had to retire. And so the two wingers were Chris Kinner and Matt Corkery. And they came to our school that week in grand final week to get a big presentation for the school. The whole place was decked out in green, and everyone just wanted to, just wish them well and celebrate, the big achievement with them. And that was sort of what was happening all around the place, because everyone had some sort of connection, and and it showed what they, those, a few of the injuries and stuff they had, what they overcame to get where they did that year. Of course, Mal was out for a long period of time because he smashed his arm into the goalpost at Seaford, and he didn't come back until the preliminary final. So I actually recall watching that grand final from the hill at the cricket ground, and it was a bloody hot day sitting in the sun there, and I can't imagine what it would have been like for the players who were in the big one.
Andrew's mentioned the rebuilding of the team over the years in the three different eras. The third of those eras was necessitated in many ways because of the money problems and the salary cap dramas of the early 90s. What are your memories of those troubles?
Yeah, that was pretty. That was a thing with covering the Raiders, and particularly when I was actually in the working in the mainstream media, was they were the biggest story, and in 1990, they were at their absolute peak. In 1990, after winning in '89. They won everything in front of them that year. They won the pre-season challenge. They stormed into the grand final. They were in three grades that year. All three grades made the grand final. They won first grade. They won the President's Cup, and reserve grade got tipped out in extra time by the Broncos. And they were at their absolute peak in 1990. And then 91 comes around. And the drama starts, and with the Raiders from that time on, not only were they a big story, but there was always a bit of drama. And I suppose there are a couple of things with it that converged. Definitely a couple of things that converged. And the first was, they were under pressure because they were trying to expand. There was an opportunity there for them because, the football team had been, so successful. But, with that, came some pressures, I guess. And they were trying to expand. And in trying to expand, they stretched themselves a bit. And that resulted in them, getting $6 million in debt. And so, that was, a big problem for them because at the same time, you had the salary cap introduced, and they were caught out from a salary cap breach in 1990 and a potential one in 91. Some of the history there, I guess, was with crowds. So, this is not the be all and end all, but it just gives you an indication. When they were first in 82, the crowds that they were getting at Seaford were, not quite 11,000, but up there, up close to 11,000. And I think, it was only, your Parramatta's and Canterbury's and Manly's who was sort of getting better crowds at the time. When they made the grand final in 89, playing out of Seaford, the average crowd was less than 10,000. So, in that period, they just weren't getting the uptick in crowds that you'd need. And so, so the move to Bruce Stadium was another important thing. They potentially could get bigger crowds. They had more corporate facilities to sell, and Bruce was always flagged as a potential home alternative in its original submission. Back in 1981 to the league, and that was proven right to go to Bruce because they went from that less than 10,000 in 89 to probably between 13 and 14,000 average in 1990. But they were under pressure to create more revenue. Plus and to expand, and so they looked at a redevelopment of the Raiders Leagues Club in a suburb called Mawson. The Raiders nightclub was another thing where they were trying to get extra people through the Queensland Leagues Club, which had a lot of bands and stuff going there. A lot of your mental as anything and the like would come there every Thursday or Saturday night, and it just all put a strain on the finances. And then that was compounded by the salary cap situation, which put them under the microscope. And where that came into play was there was. In 1990, I think it was about around 85,000 that they overspent the cap, and back then the cap was about 1.5 million. And then in unearthing that, in 91, they were heading for $100,000 overspend. And so they needed to do something to rectify that. So all the players had to take pay cuts, 15% pay cuts, to keep them, to stop them from overspending. So it meant all the contracts were all null and void, and they had to start again. And they lost a whole bunch of players at the end of 91. The fact they got to the grand final amidst all the drama was incredible. They were playing busted, all these distractions, all the contractual situation, the club future being questioned. The fact that they actually got to a third grand final was quite unbelievable. The community rallied behind them. The community raised a couple $100,000, which underlined how popular they were, and they wanted to, they wanted this team to be representing the region. And Fred Daly, he actually, was one of the faces of that. He was the Raiders' original co-patron with another Labor Party figure, Ros Kelly. And they actually did the original pitch, to the New South Wales League, back in 81 before they come to the comp. So they were, long-term supporters of the club, and we're working with local businessmen to rally around. But it was a really uncertain time. And that $200,000 that the punters raised eventually, because I think the league said, look, your salary cap's going to be reduced as a result of this, and they used that $200,000 to top back up for the next year back to the 1.5 million, so they weren't disadvantaged. But it cost administrators their jobs. It cost Chairman Jim Woodger, who was involved with the original sponsorship, or the first major sponsorship that the club had. He was chairman, and he resigned or handed over, relinquished that position. And John McIntyre, who was the CEO equivalent, lost his position as well. But the turning point was Bernie Fraser, who was an ex-local league player, but more importantly, he was the Reserve Bank governor. His experience as a Reserve Bank governor basically gave credibility back to the organisation, just to steer them back into financial credibility, and eventually the finances started to improve, and they mitigated any much further damage than where they got. But it was a difficult time, and with the salary cap only starting in 1990, you have to think about the pressures that were on the Raiders in that time, because you'd already had a pretty solid side, and then at that same time as the salary cap's coming in, you've got Daly, Stewart, Clyde, and Lazarus all coming into the team, and not only coming into the team, but coming into rep footy, and their trajectories on the way up, not just on the way up, but skyrocketing, and their values going up every day, and clearly that's putting pressure on their ability to keep them, and pressure on the salary cap. So it was difficult times, and I think the motivation was to keep everyone together, but the execution, wasn't that flash.
So can I just ask, what was the vibe about, other clubs rorting the cap back then? Because as a kid, I remember it was kind of a big deal. It was nowhere near as big a deal as the Storm one years later. It was kind of like, of course, Manly's doing it, and of course, so-and-so is doing it, and that was the memory I had of it.
Yeah, look, and that's part of the, I suppose it's part of all that grievance story, that you guys have been, talking about with, with what's, what led to Super League, and, what some of the, the factors were at play. And, that was one of the contributing things, I guess, if there was a view that, it was happening elsewhere, and that, Canberra had been singled out. But that wasn't the only thing, but certainly it was one of the contributing things. And, it goes back to a history there. So I mentioned the 13 import rule before. That was a real bugbear for Canberra. That they were, in those early years, were quite unhappy about that, and it ceased in 84. So just as they were primed to be more competitive, what happened under the 13 import rule was that after 3 years, your players qualified as a local, and so the third year came in, and then they stopped it, and so Canberra felt they were just going to be more competitive on the open market, and they changed the rules. And so, the founding father of the Raiders, Les McIntyre, he said it took him back to square one. And, a little bit of history on him is, Les was a life member of the New South Wales League. And in 1995, when that 6th of February meeting occurred, and it looked like, Kerry Packer revealed what he did about TV rights. In some of the comments that were said after that, Ken Arthurson actually called out Les and said that, someone like Les, he's going to be loyal. He'll be loyal because he'll return the loyalty that all the clubs who voted to admit Canberra into the competition gave them back in the day. And, so he wouldn't turn his back on them. Les, I don't know if you know, do you guys know much about Les or?
Yeah, some through the course of our research.
Yeah. So he was the mastermind of the Queensland United Blues, the football club, and also the Leagues Club. And so, really quickly, he was the first chairman when they set up the Blues in the late 50s. And within 3 years, he had the Leagues Club set up. And, he was a real master at fundraising in his early committee days. But once he took over the club, he was very astute in getting the Leagues Club pumping. And so, they always had a very good income, the Blues through that Leagues Club. And, he was a chair, from that time right through to 1990 of both. He was a key man for both the Blues, for the Raiders, and the Queensland Leagues Club. And so, it was their strength. It was the Queensland Leagues Club's strength in the Blues, which was, really a cornerstone of that Raiders entry into the Winfield Cup. And because those issues have been festering for all those years, the 13 import rule, the salary cap thing happened you're referring to, they felt others were doing the same. And just the general feel that, that the league was only looking after Sydney, Les had said that to me, a number of times that, they just look after Sydney and they'd sort of put up with it. So he'd always pride himself on it being a development club, that, players were coming through, and he was always cranky that, there were clubs, like in Sydney who weren't doing the development work, who were just buying all their talent. And he said, we need to be rewarded for that. We need to get dispensation. We need to get, it recognised when we're bringing players through. And he actually went and saw, and if he went with the CEO, Kevin Neal, I'm pretty sure that they went together to see Quayle and Arthurson before April Fool's Day in 95. And because, Brad Clyde, who was the real figurehead of, he was the first junior to come through Canberra's minor leagues into the Raiders and to play for Australia. And, and the Roosters were, working him hard to lure him on big money. And so they went and saw, this is what they told me, Les told me that, they went to see, Ken and John, said, what can you do to help us? And they, and Les's claim was they said, we can't do anything, so you're just going to have to, work it out. And, that's where, Les was very strong because Ken Arthurson actually rang him on April Fool's Eve to sound him out. I mentioned he called him out after the February 6th that Les won't turn his back. Les's view was, well, you've got to give loyalty to get it back. And, all of those things sort of, factored into, where some of that dissent was.
And what about you, at the newspaper? Do you remember some of your early memories of hearing about Super League and what the vibe was in the newsroom?
Yeah, so I'd taken over the main league role in 94 and, it kept coming up. There'd been, whether it was, the Rugby League story or there was a piece in the Australian and it kept coming up. And so definitely, although, you'd always check your contacts, etc. And while, the Raiders weren't, saying, too much about it, they were definitely giving me enough steer to say, look, don't rule this out. It's not paper talk. Look at where it is. Look at who's saying the stuff. Just, be alert that, this is not hyperbole. This is, there could be something in this. So I was pretty much always of the view that, there's some definitely business dealings going on and, it could turn into something and I just need to be ready to, to do my job when that happens. I definitely remember after that Origin series and the rep footy in 94 and the players coming back and, they were talking about, the money, they all swapped stories in camp and the money that was going around and some of the rich power brokers behind certain clubs. And, that was always unsettling, for the Raiders back here. They'd come back and, they might get asked to, do a release, release a player or, get pressure on them for an upgrade because, there's more money happening elsewhere. And even more unsettling because in 95, you've got the 20 teams coming in. The competition going to 20 teams in 95. So you've got your marquee players at a premium. How are we going to hold on to them in an inflated market? And so, Like it was definitely a recurring theme. I was on the Kangaroo Tour that year as well. And it was very clear that, that something was brewing. But yeah, I suppose after that early February meeting, it appeared as though it was off. Then Rupert Murdoch said it's only half time. And, then that last day in March, second last day in March, the 30th. 30th of March, when that legal action occurred, where News Limited, called out half a dozen clubs who they were going to challenge, restrain a trade over what the ARL were doing. So I remember reporting it that night and thinking, gee, there's something really, brewing now. I was on a plane the next morning because Canberra were playing in Townsville. And I actually happened to be staying at the Sheraton Breakwater Casino, which just by coincidence, where everything went down on that Friday night. So I'd heard reports on the late Friday afternoon that Sydney radio was reporting something, and I was trying to check it out as things were unfolding, but it definitely was unfolding at the time. And, I wasn't getting much out of the place. We still did a story on it that ran prominently on the Saturday, April Fool's Day. But, back then it was very early deadlines for Saturday papers, and it was pretty hard to wait late in the night to get the latest. So I pretty much was in the best possible place to sort of work through the night, canvass what was happening in the casino, canvass who was coming in and out of the foyers, and we had pretty comprehensive coverage on the Sunday paper because of where I was that night. It was it was very, very interesting, unbelievable, and it was just something that started a whirlwind that I just won't ever forget. I have to say, Steve Walters was there. I remember him being in the casino at the tables. I bumped into him there. He wasn't playing that weekend, and it wasn't practice for the club to send injured players away, especially up to Townsville. So it was pretty clear then that something was on, and I think he'd dropped the $200 on one of the games on the tables, but he wasn't too concerned about that because he'd said something to me like, after being up on the 16th floor talking to Murdoch, it was just counter change. But yeah, I've actually because I didn't want to look like a pest, with all of there's lots of different faces around the place. I had to make it look like that I was gambling, so I actually got a bunch of chips so I could sort of move around and get some of the info that was being traded. And I've actually still got one of those $50 chips because in all the helter-skelter, I didn't get to cash it all back in, or I left one in my pocket. And so to this day, I've got a $50 chip from that night when all the players were signed up.
That's amazing.
Awesome. Can we just ask you about the Kangaroo Tour? Yeah, like the 94 tour, the last tour, and that was the first one that I followed as a young teenager, and had them all on tape and everything. I always tell the story, and I loved it so much. What was it like being with the team?
Yeah, it was really good. Now I have to confess, the paper I was at, and they were very, very supportive of me going across. I mean, we had, was it 7 Raiders on that trip, and Sean McRae was the assistant coach. So there was a big representation with Mal's captain last tour, and last game he was going to be playing. Laurie, he's pretty much his deputy captain in waiting. So there was a real reason for us to be there. But I wasn't actually staying at the hotel. I was where they were staying. I was pretty much staying with a family, boarding with a family, and had a little runabout car, and I was sort of following them all around doing that and trying to catch up with their training sessions and wherever they were going. So, but they were in a pretty convenient location, and it was a brilliant experience. Like I'd always wanted to go on a Kangaroo Tour and to get to go on one of the traditional format, and to go to Central Park in Wigan, and some of the venues was really, really, really good. And the first test in Wembley, really set up the tour because, England won that. And, it was pretty controversial, how they won, but they won it with 12 men. And it meant that the second and third tests were sold out straight away. So it was a bumper tour for the English Rugby Football League. It was just a fabulous tour, and long season, certainly a long season for the players. I think my first story on on Mal on his farewell circuit that year was, back in January when he got an Australia Day gong. And then, I was still writing about his final test in Béziers in France, in late November or mid to late November. So, it was a long year, but a really, really good tour. A lot of great memories out of that.
If there's been a better finish to a career, I've never seen one. I mean, Mal Meninga's career finish was incredible.
Well, I wanted to stay with Mal and in a Super League context, look at some of the events in '95, the infamous Cronulla Leagues Club address, followed by the letter from the Immortals. Were you in much contact with Mal in the aftermath of that?
Not really, because by that was in '95. I mean, he'd sort of finished with the club at that stage. So, and he was, I was still obviously writing at that point, but it wasn't I suppose we'd done so much on Mal in '94 that it wasn't. I mean, he got a bit of coverage from us, but he wasn't the major focus because he had so much other drama with, just say that with what was happening with Laurie and Clydie and Ricky and all the others. So obviously followed that, but didn't talk to him much about that. But I guess when I did, and he did get a fair bit of criticism. Was the situation for him was that I mentioned before that he'd spent that entire year with this issue of what's he doing next, what's that going to be, and I guess for him, and it mightn't have come out great, but it was sort of the frustration that he wanted to know what he's going to be doing post playing, and he'd finished, and then nothing was coming to fruition, and I think that was the frustration coming out, in his words, which might have been not the best articulated words, but I think that's what was coming out. But certainly, for him, I don't think there was any real, lasting backlash in Canberra. I do remember, the following year, I think it was when they had a charity fundraising event, and it was a fashion parade, and they lured him back to be involved. And the roof came off when he came down the catwalk, and I remember Laurie saying afterwards, like doesn't matter, he's still the king. Mal's still the king.
Love it.
And what about when you think about Laurie Daly in particular, but Clyde and Stewart as well, became in many ways the public faces of Super League from a playing standpoint. Daly in the press went from being this kind of affable, everyone loves Laurie, to he was coming out with some strong words and getting some strong words returned back at him. Can you remember that environment and what led to that?
Yeah, and I think it was a bit uncomfortable, for those, for all the players, because what they were suddenly in was something pretty brutal, and I've heard in your earlier episodes where Graham Richardson was talking about how it's just like politics, and it was. It was propaganda warfare, and the players also felt strongly about things. I remember of all things, Bradley Clyde at the start of '95, and that's when I think he pretty much hooked up with George Mimas for his manager, because his contract was sort of running out at the end of that year. And I remember him, and it was sort of unheard of, where there was, they had the trading cards were quite popular then, and Clydie was leading the discussion on that about them getting a decent cut out of that. And I sort of hadn't heard much of that sort of talk from Brad before, and part of it was, they were looking to get a better deal. They were looking to get better conditions, and and they thought that's what that's what they'd be getting. But it was a real jump from them, where there'd been adulation for them, where they were everyone's favourite or second favourite team. And then suddenly they were in this war where people had these very strong views. And, I remember, one of the games at Cogra, where that was the day when I think Johnny Lomax and Quentin Ponga both got sent off. And, it can be a pretty hostile environment, Cogra, and they were pretty full on there. And I think on that day they had some bottles thrown at them, or at least one bottle thrown at them, and it shook them up. They were used to being pretty popular, and then suddenly they were under pressure because they were they were the faces of this thing, and it was pretty hard for him. Like you didn't see, Laurie get cranky very often. One of the times, and I digress a little bit here, but one of the times where, I did see him get upset once, it was related to his injury situation. It was in 94, and I think there might have been a letter to the editor and a bit of criticism that he was, he was playing the rep footy, and then he was out injured for the Raiders, and it was after the test against France in 94 at Parramatta Stadium, which they won well. I think he was man of the match on one leg.
I was there.
You were there?
58-0.
That's the one. Well, he went in for knee surgery after that, and on that year, I don't know if you remember, there was a show on ABC, Live and Sweaty. Andrew Denton might have been early, and Elle McFeast did the interviews, and Elle McFeast did this interview with Laurie, and it was a lighthearted format, and he took it in a lighthearted way. Was where she said to him, "Is it true they call you Tampon?" And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're in for 1 week and then for out for a few." And so park that for a moment. He played through the rep games, went and had his knee cleaned up, and then pretty soon after the surgery, it wasn't long after, he came back, and it was a full press conference at Canberra, and he was talking about how it went and what he wanted to do, and he got a bit of criticism, and it just wasn't the time. But one of the local journos decided to replay the old Tampon line at him, and just say it wasn't the time, and it wasn't a Ricky cranky, but he snapped back and said, "Who calls me that, mate?" And the journo got a bit tongue tied because he realised that had gone down like a lead balloon, and he didn't go there again. And that's one of the times that I saw Laurie quite upset. But the Super League stuff really did test them, because they were the face, and there were a lot of things they encountered with the public that they hadn't before, and it was a real test of their resilience. But for him, that period, was Laurie was in super form over those few years. 94, he came back from that knee surgery, made sure he came back for Mal's final game at Bruce Stadium, came off the bench. And he was so important to that Raiders side. Even though they got through those games without him, that was one of the challenges Tim Sheens had set them during the year, to be able to win without key players. And they beat Newcastle, racked up 50, and Cronulla by 50 with Croker at 5'8" without Daly. But he came back from Mal's farewell, and he was just so important to that team in their run home to the grand final, as you saw. And then he was 95, 96. His form, despite all that, was still just absolute top shelf. And that 96 team from Canberra, they got tipped out of the finals by St George, who obviously went on to the grand final in 96. But they had quite a few. They had a lot of injuries that year, and they got beat by 2 in the semi by the team which got to the grand final. And they were without I think Stewart, Clyde, Wiki perhaps. And Croker, from memory. They had, a 3 or 4 really good players out, who would have been more than 2 points, you would have thought. And Laurie, Laurie had a big period, and just despite, all of those distractions and all the pressure, he was still playing very, very good football.
It's a shame that every era was hampered by injuries to one of the other big 3. 91 with Stewart's groin, and Clyde perpetually injured half the season because he's played so hard. And then Laurie in the earlier years, and then, if they ever had them all together for an extended period, it could have been a proper dynasty. It
could have. Looked, and if you had said to me, Andy, in 94, that's going to be, the last grand final for, 25, 26 years, I would have said, you're going to have your head read, even 95. And this is still a bit of a quirk for me, is that, in 95, they lost 2 games all year, and they finished second, and they got a stiff deal in the semis, Granted, the Bulldogs were too strong in the preliminary final, but, they lost 2 games all year, and the first semi-final game they had to go play was at Suncorp against the third-place Broncos. Now, I think what had happened that, there'd been pressure from Brisbane, give us a final, and they just gave them a designated final day, and it just turns out that it's, Canberra against Brisbane, and it was an awesome game. It was Raiders won. It was, it was a try in it. thereabouts. It was 14-8 or there at the score, I think. And they all said it was state of origin intensity, and and neither side went on. Brisbane went out the back door afterwards, and Canberra, went out the back door as well. It took a lot out of them. But for me, when you're talking about where your windows there, 93. They were going pretty well, and then Ricky had his injury. 94, you had all your key players fit and firing end of the year, and they were just way too good. 95, just stiff in that finals where you beat Brisbane away when you finish second. Your next game's at the footy stadium, and you're playing the Bulldogs, and they were flat and probably the worst they've played in a few years. And then they're out. That team there, how well they played that year. I reckon they deserved at least a shot at the grand final. I think they were hard done by the finals format of that year.
That team is probably the all-time example of just how hard it is to win comps. But I want to move on to beyond the Canberra Times and you taking the role as Raiders media manager. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, I've actually, because I've been doing things since I was and doing the media type stuff, even though it was sort of like a hobby and a stringer for from my high school years. But I'd sort of been doing the same thing for 10 years or so, really. And I've been on the Rugby Tour and sort of made some friendships there. And Danny Lane was one of the journos on the tour who was at Rugby League Week at the time, and he facilitated a bit of a chat with Norm Tasker. And just before all the everything the war broke out in 95, I was talking to him about actually going to Sydney and working for League Week. So I was sort of open to a bit of a change. And then, the war happened, and, Rugby League Week sort of, took a big hit out of that. And I don't think it ever really recovered, I've got to say. And so our conversations sort of, just got overtaken by those events. So, I was just at a point where, do I just keep, chewing it out here, or do I, broaden my experience? And so, I got as part of what their plans were for Super League was to try and professionalise the all aspects of the administration and their public relations, and so they all of the clubs who were aligned to Super League put on media managers, and so I was approached to see by Kevin Neal to take that role for the Raiders, and that juncture of my career I was certainly open to that. I knew with what was being lined up for Super League, no matter how it went, that there was going to be some interesting people that I'd come into contact with, and some expertise and professionals that I would get to meet and learn off. And so I thought, look, this is a once in a lifetime that I should probably do that, and it's going to be beneficial for me whichever way it went. And I did it for a couple of years, and I definitely say that it was really, really interesting time, and I learned heaps.
It was an interesting strategy by News Limited. So there was you at the Raiders, Debbie Spillane at the Dogs, Neil Cadigan at the Mariners. Probably more I'm forgetting, but they were definitely going for some heavy hitters. So it was something they obviously took very seriously.
Yeah, and they had it was Trevor McEwen was involved from the Super League head office point of view, and Rebecca Wilson. They were the two that. We dealt with a lot, and they, we sort of, we worked a lot together as, in a collegiate way. They were regularly having hookups, between all of the officers, the media officers about, some of the things we could do and how we can improve things. And there was definitely a will to make it better, and there's definitely a cooperative spirit. I really felt, because with Caddo, I think he was doing a bit of the media, a bit of the marketing, and Michael Hagan was doing a bit of the media for the Hunter. And I'll never forget, I felt so bad. When the Raiders went up there to play in 97, there was a mix-up, I think, with the travel arrangements, and they didn't. Our guys who were supposed to be at the press conference were late, and so with Mal being the coach and the heavy hitters, they'd worked pretty hard to get a media contingent there, and there'd been a mix up with the arrival times, and they were late getting there, and I took a few phone calls from the Mariners guys were saying what's doing, and I really felt for them, because Andy knows especially what it was like in the town, and they were under immense pressure, and that sort of didn't help them. But I have to say that that aside, everyone worked together really strongly, and we supported each other, and as I said, worked collaboratively on a lot of things.
Well, mate, I'm interested, like, as a guy at the coalface, in this new era of professionalism, in inverted commas, we hear so much about, like, that we want to take the game forward when they go to China, blah, blah, blah. But, like, did you notice a big jump in professionalism?
What, on the playing side, you mean? Or
No. I'm talking about from the administration side.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I think so. Look, there was definitely a will to make it work, So, and there was a lot of noise, and you're in this, there was this propaganda battle going on. And when you're in the one-team towns, you're just trying to support your team as well. You're trying to support the club you work for, to get people through the gate, to engage your fans, to give the players the support they need to perform at their best. And so I think there might have been a little bit of a difference between some of the one-team towns and so Canterbury, for example, when you've got all the clubs in the one city. But yeah, look, there was definitely an effort to do it. Like some of the things might have been misguided at times. But it was all about trying to do it better and trying to give better exposure and using and partnering with the media better, to give the players a profile and the game a profile. But it was just pretty hard to do that when you're just in this constant day-to-day trench warfare, and and when you're in our place, the Raiders had a pretty once we got to the Super League year, and and there's no doubt you can have your opinions on the advertising and whatever else, but there was definitely a bigger effort to use marketing. I remember we were lining up players to do stuff on with Sony on Sega games and things like that, and do reviews and to try and get to a new audience and get the players connecting with the kids that way. And there was lots more little marketing things that were opening up to cross promote and things like that. And so I could definitely see some good advancements there. But Donny Ferner Jr., who's the CEO at the Raiders now, and he started at the Raiders in the same year, in '96, and he was looking after corporate sales. And he's one of the good guys, and has done a lot of hard yards there. And he always says now even that that unless you're winning, the best marketing in the world, unless you're winning, all your plans are out the window. You've got to have a team that's consistently performing. And that started that Super League season. The Raiders were heading for 4 straight. They won 1 game in their first 6, and I remember there was a bit of a call to arms with the admin staff for that when the Mariners came to down for that 4th game, and they were staring down the barrel at 4 losses in a row. And it was about, we need a crowd, we need to do everything we can to up the morale of the team, and we need a crowd, if there's no one here, that's just, that's a risk for us. We need a crowd. And so we just had to go to work. How are we going to get some people through? And we went to the schools and did a lot of work with the schools to try and entice people along. There was a few freebies in there as well, to encourage people to come along. And they got about 15,000 to that game, and the Raiders got home. That was their first win under Mal. But that was the one. It comes down to winning, and that sort of released the pressure valve a bit. But it was it was definitely expected of the this is where the admin team has to come in to at least play a role this week to help try and get a crowd to boost morale and try and get the best performance out of the team, because they really needed one.
Well, 15,000 for the Mariners is amazing. It's pretty hard to say come and see John Carlaw. It's like,
Yeah, well, and look, and that's the thing. That's one of the things that Donny, he called it pretty early, I've got to say. He called it very early in '97, because, 96, it was still the one competition until the court results came through. And he definitely called it early, because he's the one who was dealing with the potential sponsors and current sponsors. And, and he sort of got the litmus test, and he said, look, people don't care about these other teams. They want us to be playing Parramatta and St. George and beating them. These other new teams, it's just not the thing. And it's going to be a long year. We've got to get back together. And and it was. I don't think anyone ever really thought that it could possibly get to as bad as it did, and that that common sense would prevail. But in the best of propaganda, what they say in World War One, we'll be home by Christmas, and it was never going to happen. So if history shows you, whether it was World Series cricket or what happened in gridiron in the States, those battle for the hearts and minds in multiple competitions, they took time to sort out, and everyone realised pretty quick that there was some winners here, but the game's not winning, and we've got to move and get out of this somehow. And so it was to be in it. It was it was a very challenging time.
It was a crazy year for all the reasons you mentioned. Just heading into the end of the season, you lost the final to Cronulla to get knocked out. At that point, did it feel any different? Did it feel just like a normal season, or was there something noticeably different about it?
Yeah, it was, and I suppose one of the things is that we had the World Club Challenge in there as well, which was very different. I do remember, when I was at the paper, when I was writing the paper, the editors and things and giving you feedback and whatever, would sometimes say to me, you can be a bit more cheeky, you can be a bit more parochial, still be fair, but, you can sort of play it up a bit. There's permission to do that. But sort of when this happened, that, when Super League happened and where sentiment was, the tide turned a bit, and I remember, before that Cronulla game, there was a bit of, chat with the paper about what would happen with the T-shirts, grand final T-shirts, if we get in, and how's that going to play. And then I was in the group that sort of came up with what we said what the slogan would be, just playing on a current song, or a reasonably recent song of the time, of the 90s. And the popular one was we were going to have on the shirts, "Smells Like Green Spirit."
Great.
But we got panned. We got panned on the front page of the Canberra Times for that, so and that was sort of and it was said, geez, if we win, the shirts aren't going to go any good based on that. But, they sort of took apart the lyrics and didn't take it on, what it was meant to be, a play on the words of a pop culture song, a very popular song of the era. They sort of went into all the, the meaning behind it, and, that it's all misguided. So it was pretty hard to crack a win, But that World Club Challenge, that was it was a two-edged sword there, but it ended up being a bit of a springboard for Canberra, because when we went over for that, because the Raiders had won the first three games convincingly here, got to the 3 away games. The first game that we had was against the London Broncos at the Stoop, which is near Twickenham, right in that Twickenham precinct. And it was a Monday night, and I was already at the ground, but the bus coming from where the team was staying, which should have been no more than probably half-hour drive, if that, there was a big traffic jam. And there was a question mark whether are they going to get here? Are they going to get here for the game? And so they were getting, stripped down in the bus and whatever else, and they got there in a nick of time for the game. But even though it was a pretty, the London Broncos side, I think Terry Madison was in it, Peter Gill, Greg Barwick, who else was in the team? Russell Borden and Tony Martin, who went on to play for the Storm. So it was, mixture of journeymen and up and comers, and on paper, Raiders should have won, but they got mugged that night, and that was their World Club Challenge over, because the Aussie teams weren't dropping games, and you drop a game, you're out of contention. So it was a really, really difficult thing for them to bounce back from. Just what are we doing here now? And so I was really impressed with how they sort of knuckled down. Then how do we regroup? And so they did. They beat Halifax in the next one, and then they actually had a bit of a bonding session with the Australian cricket team, because they were staying at the same hotel, the Holiday Inn at Leeds, where the '94 Kangaroos stayed as well, and that's where the Australian cricket team was staying for their Test match. And they went to the game for the final day, where the Aussies wrapped up the Ashes, or secured the Ashes, and because they were staying at the same place, they invited them into the change rooms, and they came back, and the after party was sort of at the hotel. And they had it's actually mentioned in Steve Waugh's tour diary from that Ashes series about the night they had with the day and night they had with the Raiders guys. And he reflects on, and I actually saw this happen, was Steve Waugh, I think his twin brother, definitely Michael Kasprowicz, and maybe Brendan Julian, decided they wanted to tackle Mal. They said, come on, you want you to run this. So they threw him a Foster's can, and he said, okay. And so they cleared a few things, and he had a bit of a run at him, and they just skittled like 9 things. And that made Steve Waugh's book. And so, that was a buzz for, both the teams. And then they set about the next week, and they went to Wigan to play Wigan at Central Park, and, scored 50 points on them there. And they had an okay side, Gary Connolly and Andy Farrell. And they were one of the English sides to make the finals, and Canberra put 50 on them twice in the series. Canterbury, they'd beaten Canterbury twice. And when they played the Broncos, who won the whole thing, the Bronx might have got 30 on them, but certainly not 50 like the Raiders did twice. So that was a bit of a springboard for when they came back, and they had a good run into the finals, and they made a bit of a charge again. Some injuries got them a bit, in that final series. But they went pretty close. But, I was impressed with, from a real low, going down to the Broncos, to how they regrouped, got their mojo back, and made a bit of a run at things. And it was, it was a real good life lesson there about, do you kick stones, or, how do we actually, get morale in the place back and have a red hot crack, and they did it.
That's a great story about the London Broncos, man. Like, Peter Gill was so underrated as the heart and soul of that club in that era. Gun.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface. We could probably go for another couple of hours on Raiders history, but we do need to finish up. So I just wanted to bring it back full circle. And, after a long period in the wilderness, that the Raiders are finally back as a force, and a team that, once again, kind of the nation's second team. Can you talk about the current crop and what you think about the team today, and this appetite for the team in the town compared to the glory years?
Yeah, it's come a long way, and I'd say, it's they're really well embraced now. Like, there was no doubt a period where they lost a bit of connection there, and the recent years, and the effort they've gone to make, the experience at the home games as well. Something that's that people want to be part of, the Viking clap, the blowing of the horn, but just the culture in the place, how they conduct themselves, the way they've connected with the community. There's been a real effort there. There's a real pride in the history of the club. And it's you can really tell it's a good bunch of people and a good team that Ricky's assembled there. And I think the supporter base is really strong. They're really liked around town. The roster's good. I think what they've done. People want to be part of it again. And I saw Donnie at the start of the year. I bumped into him and Donnie Ferner and Junior, and just things were on such a wave at the end of last year. And he's been there since '96, and it's been a hard road for him, hard road to hoe, because it has been such a long time since they've been back contending, and just as every time they look like doing something really good, something comes up, to present a challenge or to make it difficult for them. And and this year 2020, they were really excited about the depth of the club, and the underpinning junior side they've got to the first grade team. They were really steeled for a big year, and they had a great year. But the wind was out of the sails a bit, because of what we've all had to put up with this year. And so that was a bit of a hitch, really. But I think based on what they did this year, against those odds, I reckon they'll be prepared well for next year. And it won't be too long before we have them having another grand final. And I can't wait to see that day when they do raise that premiership trophy again.
Well, Bevan, I think Ricky needs to be singled out for his outside-the-box thinking. First of all, he's my favourite player of all time, so I'm biased, but he revolutionises the game with kicking and passing as a player. Then he couldn't get some free agents to Canberra, so he just goes to England and just pillages the best talent ever. I think without that aspect of it, I think we're still struggling.
Yeah, and look, and they had to do something, and and I think, sometimes pressure and events mean you do have to do something, and they were going the traditional route, trying to recruit players here, and it wasn't working, so they had to find another way. And full marks for what they've done. And Elliot Whitehead, what a recruit he's been, what he's given him, all the positions he's played, and just a real footballer. The halfback now, George Williams, if he had been there last year, I reckon they win the grand final last year if he's there in 2019. they've done really well, and to see Jack Whiten come on like he has, Josh Papali's just immense, means so much to that club. I just think they've got a great spirit, and they've done really well. I'm looking forward to seeing how this new recruit goes that they're bringing out, the back rower who's coming out as well to add to that contingent. But it's been shrewd, and they've executed it well. But the thing is that they've bonded so well together, and I think there's I definitely think that their premiership window is still alive and well, and certainly not closed.
Well, it might be hard for you to answer this one, but if you had to pick, as a lifelong Raiders fan, if you had to pick one, your all-time favourite Raider.
Yeah, it's really hard, mate. That's really hard. It's hard to, when you look at things through kids' eyes, it's probably, when I was a kid is probably, what sticks out to me. And they're going to say, what are you saying here? But I always loved Jay Hoffman, father of Ryan Hoffman.
Awesome.
Yeah, he just typified, what they did in building the club. He just toiled and gave them great service, and was a really good club man. And he didn't have all the razzle dazzle of many of the other players that have come through, but I just always connected with him as a kid, and really respected what he did to build the foundations, because what those men and young fellas did in those early days did set things up for what's brought so much joy to a lot of people. And he was my hero then, and it's pretty hard to eclipse what he did.
I love that answer, because up here in Newcastle, you talk about David Mullane and Paul Marquette and these sort of guys from the early Knights teams up here, and people still love them the same way you love Jay Hoffman. It's like the guys that standing on the shoulder of giants, as they say,
Yeah, and it's all clubs have those people, and and it's sort of why it's why the likes of Craig Bellamy's been such a success. The attitude that he had, and my dealings with him, whether he was a player or a coach or as a workmate, he was just always always transparent. You knew where you stood with him, and he just gave 150%, and really, really good human beings. And it doesn't. I don't know if anyone knew how good Bellyache was going to be as a coach, but I'll tell you what, you don't begrudge what he's done. He's been fantastic, and especially when he's been involved in top class footy for many years now. It's going back to the '82. It's quite a record that he's returned.
Well, Bevan, I'll leave you and Andy to go on for another 3 hours off air with some Raiders talk. We'll end it here. So we'll just say up the milk. This was fantastic, incredible insight. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, fellas. I've really enjoyed it, and keep up the great work with the show. It's a beauty.
Oh, thanks, mate.
Thank you, mate.
Bevan Hannan, thank you again.
Cheers, guys.